Hello and welcome back to the Thomas Fitch Sports Show. I am Thomas Fitch. Texas is bowl eligible for the first time in 3 years after an excellent 28-14 win in Morgantown, West Virginia. We're going to recap that, talk some college football playoff, and if we have extra time, we're going to get some questions from the people watching live. This is the Thomas Fitch Sports Show.
Let go of everything.
All right, so let's start off with some takeaways from the game. First of all, it was really our most complete performance. Both the defense and offense were kind of equally impressive. I would say the offense excelled a little bit more than in the past, and the defense did a little bit worse. And the only reason I say that is because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, Will Greer went out early on. But overall, very, very good showing. But the one thing, one disappointing factor in this game is as the offense does better, we start to have to punt from midfield from the 40. That hurts Michael Dixon's punting average. So Tom Herman, just quit punting when you're on the 40. Just go for it. We're trying to get this guy a Heisman, and you're ruining his chance really of having a good chance to win the Heisman. So let's start talking about the offense. So there is a reason why I've been saying that Sam should be starting over Shane. Shane starts the game. He goes 4 of 7, 28 yards, doesn't do much, no touchdowns. All of a sudden, you bring in Sam, 12 of 19, 136 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 bad pick. But it's more than just that. It's more than the fact that he has 9 carries for 68 yards on the run. He has this intangible quality that you put him in there, and it just changes the whole aspect of the game. It's incredible, and I get that he's been hurt, and that's why he hasn't had a lot of playing time. But he just has something special to him to go into Morgantown and carry this team to a win. I thought what was really impressive is he has that bad pick six in the second half. When you're driving, you're in the red zone, just tries to throw it away, which was a very dumb, a very freshman mistake. And he just tries to throw it away and throws a pick six. And he comes back the next drive and just has more confidence. And we've really seen that all year. I remember against Kansas State, the first throw he made was an interception. He comes back the next drive and he leads them on a touchdown drive. And so he has an incredible poise to him, and it's those mistakes. It's this pick six. It's the interception against Oklahoma State in overtime. It's the fumble against USC in overtime. These are the plays that are actually growing him the most. When he goes on a good drive, he's not growing as much as, the amount of learning and knowledge that he gets from just playing, whether it's at USC or home against Oklahoma State or Kansas State in an overtime environment, plus the fact that he's made mistakes, learning from those, learning how it feels to make those mistakes, but how, it feels to come back and fix those. That is an incredible amount of experience that he's getting at a very young age. And hopefully with the 2 or 3 years, after this year, 2 or 3 years he has left with the program, hopefully they'll help him to become a very elite college quarterback. Another thing that really, really helps, Connor Williams is back. He is absolutely back, folks. And the team finally had more rushing yards than passing yards. In total, there was 187 passing yards, and that includes 23 of Gerard Hurd's on a little pass back to Sam Ehlinger. A great play called by Tim Beck. This was actually a much better called game. And I think a large part of Tim Beck calling a better game is Connor Williams when you can have holes and lanes for the running backs to run through, it makes it so much easier to develop a passing game, to get the sweeps and the slants and everything. It just spreads you open. Young led the charge for the Horns, 12 carries for 85 yards. Ellinger was the second highest rusher, 9 carries for 68 yards. But a lot of other guys, Porter had 7 for 53. That was his best running game that I've ever seen him do this season. Carter, 10 for 27, not as good as him. But Williams made a huge aspect because the quarterbacks had time to throw, the running backs had lanes to run through, and it revolutionized our offense. And so the one bad part about this is there was kind of, some talk that, okay, first 2 games of the season or game and a half before he gets injured, doesn't look great, has some holding calls, and then he goes down and gets injured. Is that going to hurt his draft stock? Would he stay around, get a medical scholarship, and try to build back up his draft stock next year? But he comes in this game, first play of the game, and pancakes a guy, and then helps the team to 233 rushing yards. That's going to help his draft stock immensely. I think he'll be a top 5 pick, and he's going to be the hardest one to convince to stay because, why would you? There's so much, as he's already seen, there's so much of a risk for injury to come back for another year when you're already going to be a really good draft pick. So unfortunately, there's a good chance we lose him, but just an incredible aspect that he brought to the team. The other thing, so the defense. Let's move to the defense, which was not a bad performance at all. You limit a good West Virginia team to 14 points at home. However, you have to look at Will Grier gets injured early in the game. He was 6 for 8 for 50 yards at the time, and Chugunov comes in. He was 14 of 26, 189 yards, 1 touchdown. So not a great game for him, but he actually, for a backup quarterback, he actually had some really nice throws, and West Virginia has a bunch of incredible receivers that made some great catches. But other than the fact that we weren't facing Grier, it was a good defensive game. Held West Virginia to 14 points, shut them out in the first half, and 7 of those points were off the pick six. So really 7 points that the defense gave up. One guy that I really want to shout out is Devontae Davis. Last week we looked at Antoine Davis, who had a good game. He had another good game this game, 6 tackles, 5 solo. But Devontae Davis is another one of those guys coming off the bench because of the Holton Hill suspension and actually having a really good game. He had seven total tackles. 7 they were all solo, and he was just flying around everywhere, doing a really, really good job of making tackles. So that's impressive. Obviously, Malik, 7 total, 6 solo. Gary Johnson had 7 total tackles and a sack. So overall, it was a good. Holding a team to 7 points, giving up 7 offensive points is not a bad defensive performance. Definitely much improved from last week at Kansas, and that was one thing I said last week was if you want to beat West Virginia, you're going to have to improve on last week. So that that was the only thing is you just got to improve, and they did, and so that was a good job by Orlando, and it feels like we're just counting the minutes we have left with him, counting the minutes we have left with Connor Williams. Maybe Holton Hill, maybe Malik, but this is a really good defense. And hopefully the way that recruiting's been, even losing guys like Malik and Holton Hill, it can still be impressive in the future. So that was the defense. Again, we talked a little bit about Dixon earlier. He had 7 punts for 301 yards. His longest was 59, but there was nothing wrong with his performance. It's just he didn't have a lot of room to punt with. His most impressive punt, he had one where the only thing to do, he had to pin him. He was punting around midfield, trying to pin him deep in, um, in the end zone, and just a beautiful little pooch kick. And you could see, when he's not just trying to crush the ball because he just barely kicks it, and a perfect little kick. Chris Boyd like catches it like he's a receiver on the 2. That is some impressive stuff. It was only like a 40-yard kick, but stops him on the 2. That is NFL level stuff that you're seeing from him, where it's not all kicking, 60, 70-yard punts. It's also the fact that he can pin you inside the 20, that kind of things. So he's got one game left, actually, 2 with the bowl game, but one game left before the Ray Guy and Heisman Award. And, I saw people were talking about Baker Mayfield, and he made some crude gestures. Is that going to hurt him for Heisman? Well, if that hurts him for Heisman, who do you give it to? Because, like I've said, Saquon's dropped off. Bryce Love has dropped off a little bit, and he's not quite electric enough. To be a running back and win, you either have to be from Alabama or be super electric. And Bryce Love just hasn't had that kind of electric following. So Notre Dame started to lose. That hurts their running back. So it's like, who else do you give it to other than Michael Dixon, who has been one of the best punters? So before we look a little bit ahead to Texas Tech and talk some college football, for my viewers watching, if you want to post some questions, we have a little shorter of a show, but if you want to post some football-related questions, or it can be non-football but has to relate to the show, keep it PG. Post some of those, and we can answer those after I talk about college football. But anyways, Texas hosts Texas Tech next week, or this week on Friday, and so Black Friday, the team is going to be full after Thanksgiving, but that'll be an interesting game. You look at, because for Texas, there's like less motivation as far as trying to make a bowl game, but Tech, they're still in the hunt to make a bowl game, so they'll be motivated. But it'd be I think a 7-5 season. One thing that I talked about at the beginning when we started off slow is, at this point, your goal is to win as many games to show recruits that you are trending upwards. And if you can win 7 games in the regular season, maybe win the bowl game, go to 8 wins, that shows recruits, okay, maybe you aren't winning 10 games and competing for the Big 12, but it's also Herman's first year. And you're working with new players, new schemes. So all of a sudden these guys are saying, okay, they've gone from 5 wins to 8 wins. They looked impressive. They had a lot of close losses. Now I want to go in and be part of the revolution. So that is why this Texas Tech game is actually a really huge matchup. Not necessarily on paper. It doesn't have any actual influences, but it's important long term as far as recruiting is concerned. So we're running out of time for the first show, but we'll go into a part 2, because we're going to talk about the college football playoff. It was a very, very calm weekend in college football inside the top 10. There were no upsets. So, and when you see a weekend where there's no upsets, Miami was close, but they scored 30 straight points and looked dominant in the second half. That's what a lot of these teams will do. You saw Bama played Mercer. Clemson had a small team. Auburn had UL Monroe. So a lot of these teams, the week before rivalry week, are playing not great. Your FC, or not necessarily FCS, but non-Power 5 teams as kind of a game to get back, get healthy. Which I'm not a super big fan of, but if you're going to play Mercer at some point in the season, I get why they schedule it then, but I think it's a little cheap, because that compares to, you look at Miami, who's playing Virginia, who's a 6-4 team going into the last week, a decent team. If they lose, it just hurts them versus playing Mercer, who you're not going to lose to. Anyways, we are running out of time, so we will be right back after this. Okay, so we are back with part two of the Thomas Fitch Sports Show, recapping Texas versus West Virginia, and now moving on to talking about college football, the college football playoff. So back to what I was talking about. The thing is, a loss earlier on this season is a lot more redeemable than later on. Like, look at Oklahoma. They lost to Iowa State early on. Now they're back in the top four because it happened early on and they can win out from now. If Oklahoma had been undefeated and lost to Iowa State, say, this past weekend or this next weekend, that would really hurt their chances to make the playoff. And so I think that's why it's kind of cheap that these teams are playing nobody's second to last week of the season. I think unless you have a rivalry or you're having to reschedule a game, you shouldn't play a non-conference game, in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season. Anyways, so my top four remained unchanged. Bama number 1, number 2 Miami, number 3 Oklahoma, and number 4 Clemson. And after I give you, I'll go through the rest of. I'll go tell you 5 and 6. Here's where it changed. I said Wisconsin 5 and 6 is going to be Auburn, and so the only thing. Oh no, sorry, no, 6 is actually going to be Georgia. My bad. 6 is Georgia, but I do want to go through the top 10 and say who. Or go through and say the chances that all these teams make the playoffs, or what has to happen for all these teams. But anyways, Bama's number 1. They beat Mercer big. No reason to bump them out. Miami, this could be questionable because they have a close win over Virginia. But again, I think at this point it doesn't matter that much, and I'm all in favor for giving you points for being undefeated. And so that's why they're up there. OU stays at 3, and Clemson stays at 4. OU had an easy, both those teams playing nobodies, although OU actually had a conference game against Kansas. Wisconsin at 5, they are the closest. I mean, this is the closest they've ever been to jumping in. They really impressed me in the second half against Michigan. They really blew them away. And so at this point, earlier on, I was thinking, if Wisconsin wins out, there's going to be some questions on should they be in the top 4. But impressive wins over Iowa and Michigan in back-to-back weeks. If they can beat Ohio State, if they can win out and beat Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship, there's no doubt in my mind that they should be in the playoff. Georgia, the reason I have them jumping over Auburn had a slow start against Louisiana Monroe. Versus Georgia had an impressive win against a good Kentucky team. So and they really just blew out Kentucky. So that's the reason why I have Georgia there instead of Auburn. But we are now going to talk about, or actually, first I'm just going to say, I think the committee, I don't think their rankings will change. I think it'll stick with Bama, Clemson, Miami. Well, OU might jump over Miami because of the close Virginia game. But again, it doesn't matter that much. So top 4 and really top 5 are basically all in if they win out. Alabama, they win out, they're in. Miami, they win out, they'd have to beat Clemson, they'd be in. Oklahoma wins out, beats TCU in the conference title game, they're in. Same with Clemson except for beating Miami. Now the question arises, and the same question would come up with Alabama, is what happens if they make it to the conference championship game undefeated and lose. I think Alabama could make it in with 1 loss. However, I don't know if Miami could. I think it depends on what happens everywhere else. But Alabama has Auburn this weekend, which is going to be a really good slate of games in this weekend. Alabama plays Auburn. Clemson plays a good South Carolina team who has 8 wins. Miami has Pitt, so that's not a great game. Georgia has Georgia Tech, Ohio State, Michigan, and even though Michigan's not ranked anymore, it's still playing Michigan on the road, so that'll give us a good feel for that. So going back, so Wisconsin, all they have to do is win out, and they're in. So then we come to number 6, and these are going off the AP Top 10 rankings, by the way. Number 6, Auburn. What they have, as far as the 2-loss teams, the easiest path to make it in, because if they finish off the season beating Alabama and then beating Georgia again in the conference championship game, there'd be very little doubt in my mind that they would keep out a 2-loss SEC championship team like Auburn, who had a close loss to Clemson early on in this season when the running back was hurt. And so I just think, and they had a loss to LSU, who is now ranked. So I think Auburn has a good chance of getting in as a 2-loss team, but they're going to have to win out. I think the only team who can safely make it in without winning out is Alabama, but they would have to beat Auburn. They would have to at least play in the SEC championship game, but I think they could lose that and still make it in. Which takes us to Georgia, who they would be facing in the SEC championship game if they beat Auburn. And so this is where it could get interesting, is if a Georgia team could beat Alabama, and then you would have 2 one-loss SEC teams. Could they both make it in? And I really don't have a problem with that, especially when you look at the playoff committees favoring towards the SEC, and they're going to do whatever they can to get Alabama in that. Speaking of the playoff committee doing everything they can, Ohio State, I call them the SEC team in the Big Ten, because we know the playoff committee likes SEC teams, especially Alabama, and Ohio State, they really like to get them in. We saw that with the first college football playoff, where they questionably got in as the 4th seed, but then they rewarded the playoff committee by winning it all. So Ohio State, they are where it basically ends with, if you win out, you're in, because they have 2 losses, like Auburn, but their losses aren't as good. They have the one that looks the worst is to Iowa, and that's a loss that keeps looking more and more worse, because Iowa lost to Purdue this past week, so they're now a 5-loss team, and their other losses to Oklahoma, which is a fine loss at this point, and it was early on in the season. But the Iowa loss is just lingering, and it wasn't. Oklahoma lost a close game to Iowa State, to Iowa State. Ohio State got blown out by Iowa, who also beat Iowa State. But you can't look that much into college football; your brain will explode. Anyways, so they need help. If they were to win out, that bumps Wisconsin out of there. But again, Wisconsin not in the top 5. We know that either Miami or Clemson likely won't be in there, whoever loses in that conference championship game. And who knows if Clemson could lose this week or Miami gets upset by Pitt. So Ohio State could use all the chaos it could get, but they need to beat Michigan soundly and beat Wisconsin soundly. And they need what would be best, probably, because a 2-loss Clemson team is not going to make this playoff. So they would need Miami to either to beat Clemson or Clemson to beat Miami very badly, so that Miami couldn't be considered to get in there after losing as a 2-loss team. A 1-loss team, but after losing in the conference championship. So they need that. I think it would help them if they would need Alabama to win out and beat Georgia, because if you get 2 SEC teams in there, it's just going to convolute. Or Auburn, 2 winning out. But again, then raises the question: as a 1-loss Alabama team who hasn't won the SEC championship, would they get in over Ohio State team who won the Big Ten? And so that's where it just gets crazy. But I think people are discounting Wisconsin too soon. This is a Wisconsin team who is recently looking really good. They're on a roll, and don't be surprised if Wisconsin goes in the Big Ten championship. And it would be crazy, because if Wisconsin was to beat, they were to remain undefeated, and Ohio State was to beat Michigan. If Wisconsin beat Ohio State in the Big Ten, that'd be considered an upset, a major upset, even though they have 2 less losses than Ohio State. But don't be surprised if that happens. Number 9 is Notre Dame, and really the same goes for TCU. But Notre Dame needs a lot of chaos. They only have one loss, and it's to Miami, who's ranked in the top four. But what really hurts them is the fact that they don't have a conference championship game. And so when either Alabama or Auburn is playing Georgia, Miami's playing Clemson, Oklahoma's playing TCU, Ohio State's playing Wisconsin, while all that's going on, they're just going to be sitting on the couch. And they had a good loss. Sorry, Notre Dame does have two losses. I apologize. Notre Dame has a good. I mean, their two losses are to teams who could both be in the playoffs. So that is going for them, but it just the lack of a conference championship hurts them, and it will be interesting if you see more chaos happening where some teams get upset. Maybe Clemson gets upset, or Miami gets upset, or Ohio State gets upset. Something like that happens this weekend, where there's actually more of a chance for them to get in, and they still don't. It'll be interesting to see if Notre Dame makes a push to join a conference because the lack of a conference championship game is hurting them. Number 10 is TCU, and again, not a good chance. They're just losses to Iowa State, which is now hurting as Iowa State is now a 4-loss team, and Oklahoma, and they would have to beat Oklahoma, which would bump Oklahoma out. But again, like Notre Dame, they need so much stuff to happen. They need a lot of stuff to happen this week and conference championship week and it's too complex for me to just say. I mean, I would have to have a board and have moving pieces here and here and here, and Clemson drops and Oklahoma drops and Alabama gets. There's just a lot needs to happen for Notre Dame and TCU to make it in. So I'm not going to say not going to happen, but again, they need absolute chaos that only college football can bring to make it in. The other undefeated team is UCF, and I've been a big proponent calling for the 18 playoff, not 18, 8-team playoff, and I would love to see UCF get a chance, and it would be a shame because they would probably be an 8 seed if they made it in playing Alabama and probably get killed because maybe not this year, but other years. But I want to give the non-Power 5 teams a chance. And, you look at who the 4 through 8 was, or sorry, the 5 through 8. That's Wisconsin, that's Auburn, that's Georgia, and Ohio State. All teams who really, we said have a chance to make the playoffs if they win out. And I also think we're going to, like I've said, it's going to kind of solve itself out by the time that we get in 2 weeks. But still, I think the way you take an 18 playoff is you throw out the New Year's 6 games, or you could do a 6-team playoff and do the top 2 teams have byes, but some way, because people say you're gonna still have arguments over 8 and 9, but there's a lot less argument over Ohio State Notre Dame than there is over Wisconsin and Clemson or Oklahoma right now, because the 8 and 9 have a lot less of a chance than 4 and 5, which have a lot less of a chance than 2 and 3, or when you get down there. And so I think that's a perfect number where 9 might be mad they don't make it, but they have a lot less of a chance of making it or of winning it all than the 5 seed. And so that's why and the thing that really blows my mind is the NCAA loves making money. How much money would they make? Because the New Year's 6 games now matter a whole lot less because of the semifinal, the playoff semifinals. They're still fun to watch, but they matter less. Whereas when you just had 2 teams, the Fiesta Bowl and the Rose Bowl, they were all a lot more exciting because they were kind of like consolation prizes. Now, with these semifinals, it doesn't matter as much. And so I think you would get so much more revenue. And if you stretch the bowl games out, maybe have one before Christmas, one New Year's Day, and then one, January 7th or 8th or whatever. And so I think that would be a great decision on the part of the NCAA. But as of right now, I believe the 14 playoff is in a deal through like 2020. So it might be till then until we can even get a chance at getting this 18 playoff. But as a fan of college football, I think that would just be the best thing to happen in the sport and would be incredibly exciting. Anyways, we're running out of time. We got a full 2 episodes in for y'all today. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back probably this time next week after the Texas Tech game. From the Thomas Fitch Sports Show, I am Thomas Fitch.
Let go of everything.